Hey, good morning, everybody. It's about 11 a.m. out in Sedona, Arizona right now. So please forgive the video quality. I mean, everything should be good, like in general, but I'm just getting started right now, just doing a little bit more promotion for the counseling and the mentoring and the consulting. So these are just going to be stream of consciousness whenever I feel it. Just, if you search my name, you can find music from me, you can find interviews from me. If you go to my YouTube channel, Tiger's Eye Portal, you can see a 2 hour talk there that just basically is focused on farming, where the vanguard of regenerative agriculture is. So, and I'm just going to be taking some notes as well. I may forget people's names or channels that I want to promote, so I'm just trying to get more organized. And then also just putting it out there as far as videographers and other channels and whatnot. I'm open to doing interviews, and if people, want me to go more in depth on various things, then we can. So yeah, I'm just gonna let it rip and just keep doing these videos whenever I see them. So anyone who's interested can get a better idea of what I do. And please post in the comments questions, especially if you're not in a position to afford a formal session. Uh, uh, Intro calls are free, discovery calls. So they usually, like 20, 30 minutes to talk, see if, there's anything I can help you with or point you in the right direction. It's $356 for 3 hours of my time, no matter what we're talking about. And you'll get the full 3 hours, if we do an in-depth session, they can go for a couple hours. But yeah, you're always going to get, whatever time is left over. So if you can't afford that or, just not feeling it, post questions. Then I can elaborate, I can do a video on your question and, just keep things moving like that. So what I'm realizing as I do more gardening for people, I'm not really realizing, this has been a part of my path and I've known it for a long time, but it's just kind of coming to a head. Because once you start to raise the vibration and the health and the quality and the environment around people, more comes up to the surface. So if it's a couple, their stuff might come up, or just health stuff, all sorts of things. But they're activations. We're terraforming the planet. The planet's got a long ways to go. Look out in your local neighborhood. Are there gardens everywhere? Are you feeding yourself? Can you feed yourself, relatively locally? So all these things are going on, and that's a reality. So and just being more open about that. And as far as being more open, as we see disclosure just picking up more steam, I want to, get into talking more about that, more about my experiences, and just to start to offer, various channels and, people to follow who I feel pretty good about. And anything that I recommend, I would always ask you to what I call the 90-10 rule. So we're all here, we're all incarnated, we're always learning. So if someone is 90% super solid on a particular subject, then they're still, they still have the other 10%, so just always keep that in mind, especially when you're encountering different personalities. And someone may be very knowledgeable on the subject, but their interpersonal skills aren't the best. Dr. Greer is a good example. I've got and on that, I'm only going to comment on, people who are public figures. I'm a public figure, so people can, comment on me, but not personal. When I talk about interpersonal dynamics, I'm going to be talking about cancer and family healing and trauma and things like that. So I'm never going to mention any family member by name or anything like that. But there's really no way to, talk about your mom, talk about your dad, whatever, if you want to give people context. And so, and if you had a good relationship with your parents, you want to honor your parents in that way. If the relationship wasn't great, you want to be honest about that. When you move into talking about forgiveness, which we'll touch on at some point, is the person actually asking for forgiveness? So a lot of people try to force themselves to forgive someone who isn't even asking for forgiveness. And there's a lot to be said on that. So as far as Greer is concerned, yeah, and I'm in a couple of his documentaries, just really short, like little parts, but it does show some of my experience with them in the field and in general, just really great. But there are a number of things, as far as that I don't agree with Dr. Greer, and it's more interpersonal. He's not a great communicator. And so one of the hardest things as far as, dealing with people is, yeah, you could be just really knowledgeable or had some amazing experiences, but what are your interpersonal skills like? Can you handle criticism? Can you handle someone not agreeing with you? So, yeah. So I'm just going to be taking some notes as far as some of the people that I'm mentioning. Put my reading glasses on. And in the comments and whatnot, one of the things, because it's kind of big that happened recently, was Dr. Greer actually co-opted a photograph that somebody else took and didn't give that person credit. And that's a big deal, especially, Greer's in Washington, D.C., with, revealing incredible things. And, here he talks about a picture as if it's his own, but doesn't give the credit to the person and what the person went through, because his life completely changed once he posted that picture. So that person is Jorge Pabon, JP. So you can easily find his channel. He's really big on exopolitics with Michael Sala. Another good resource just to hear, various stories. People following all the disclosure dumps, which is great. They're not a nothing burger. It's just slow. Not everyone on the planet knows that ETs are a reality and interacting with humanity is a reality, and it is, and it's been happening, since the dawn of time. It's a big part of our history and will continue to be a huge part of the process as time goes on. I will get into politics if people want to, but getting into politics will bring me into talking about logical fallacies, which is just huge. So we as, spiritual people or whatever, channeled information and all this, there's just logical fallacies are just one of the best ways to ground you. And it doesn't matter in your own verbiage, with channels or spiritual teachers or politician. If you verse yourself in logical fallacies, you can see if people are telling the truth, whether consciously or unconsciously. So if someone is malicious and they're using logical fallacies, it's easy to show that they're lying. But so many of us use logical fallacies without even being conscious of it. Think about if you were a kid growing up and quit crying or I'll give you something to cry about, but versing yourself in logical fallacies is just an incredible tool. It came up really strongly, in Plato's era, when they're, in debate forums. And if people, we could have started learning logical fallacies in, third grade or something, and, just become much better people, much more logical people, clear thinking people. And that is spiritual. Thinking deeply is not the same as thinking clearly. So logical fallacies are important. When I'm doing retreats for people or participating in retreats for people, sometimes in those integration sessions, I'm just letting them know, just study logical fallacies. It's just so grounding. You can find it in your own verbiage, to see if you're being logical, and logos, logic is truth. So, in the beginning, it wasn't in the beginning was the word, and the word is with God, and in the beginning was the logos. We're talking about truth. And one of the things that I've been thinking about lately, because it comes up, in the morning, I wake up, and I meditate. I check in on the Gaia channel just to see, what the, latest thing is being talked about. And there's just all this stuff going on talking about creating your own reality. You don't create your own reality. Co-create your reality, sure. but it's just really arrogant to say that you create your reality. So if I'm standing next to you, did you create me? Obviously not. So co-creating, sure, you've got what, 9 billion, free will souls on the planet right now. And it's the same thing when people talk about NPCs. Like, how arrogant is that? Like, life is about you, and everyone else around you is just a non-playing character to forward you on your journey. Like, every one of those people is a soul on their own path, and different levels of awareness, which is another good word as far as awareness as opposed to consciousness. Everyone talking about raise your consciousness. It's not raising your consciousness, it's raising your awareness of what is really going on. And I see that in videos too. The reality of this, the reality of that, or this is what's, and there is truth. My favorite transcendental argument when I learned about what transcendental arguments were, which is basically truth, but that you don't have to have a double-blind study for. So just like everything is an illusion, we're in a simulation. So the transcendental argument and the refutation for that is that if everything is an illusion, then what you're saying is an illusion as well. So nihilism is the opposite of truth. There's a truth. There is the truth. And another thing that people get into is people talk about, own your truth. Like, that's your truth. No, it's not. You don't own it. Like, it may be the truth of your experience, which is good, when and you can see, when you get argumentative with people, like, if you're talking about just the truth of your experience, you shouldn't be upset if someone just questions the truth of your experience. It's just and just be fine with that. That's what you experience, that's what you saw, that's what you heard. We'll get into deeper levels of this as far as dreaming. I walk the Toltec path, we'll talk more about that. I'm 50 years old now. My awakening started about age 15. I had my Kundalini awakening at 19. But my Kundalini awakening was all Toltec vibes. It was all, the energy centers that I saw and everything was all from the Toltec background that I had. It wasn't, 7 chakras and things like that, which I am not even completely sure of as far as the reality, the metaphysical reality of that. I don't mind talking about chakras sometimes, because I know about chakras. My body will bring up energies or tensions or different places in my body, to help me, realize something. But as far as the Toltec perspective is, and it lines up with a lot of the Asian teachings, there's just many more energy centers than that. So during my awakening experience, my Kundalini awakening, when that energy released, and there was also childhood trauma in that, which I've talked about before. If you go over to my Unity Embodiment channel, I'm trying to migrate everything over to Tiger's Eye Portal, and then my music channel, which is SKO Music. If you search me on Spotify, search me on Apple Music. There's another Shankio who does music, but it's more like singer-songwriter stuff. My stuff, I do singer-songwriter stuff, but all the stuff that's online is just more electronic. So that's another thing I'm just trying to promote, just being out, playing music more, just collaborating with people, and all that. So, so as far as the shamanic path, I help a lot of people, especially young kids who are waking up or having some really intense awakening experiences and trying to figure out what the hell is going on. Just like, the internet is just so huge right now. We used to have to go to bookstores. I remember back in the day, just digesting all the, channeled, information from Sedona and, everything. And it's just so much different now in a lot of ways. I do recommend for sure. I haven't met him in person. As far as I know, he's in Sedona. But the latest person to actually fully interact with Don Juan Matus's lineage, his name is Lujan Matus. So I definitely recommend his book and his materials. And it's so amazing because now that, like the next iteration of the Toltec teachings and these teachers speaking out, Like Don Juan's like a kung fu master, you know, they're hanging out with ETs. It's super cool. So just really great information. He's relatively accessible, teaches a bunch of soft and hard kung fu practices. And there's some things that I don't agree with, you know, but we're people, you know, different experiences, you know, I'll kind of elaborate on some of those things. One of the things that I've thought about doing is basically an entire like Toltec book series, going all the way back to Castaneda. Castaneda is, you know, hugely controversial, and, you know, many people who made it up and, you know, things like that. But there's just a lot of truth. I mean, they were huge. I mean, my awakening happened, you know, at 15, you know, when I first, you know, got one of those books and experienced my first like true like bridging of the dream as far as being old enough to consciously aware, to be aware of it. And that's what we call in the Toltec tradition deja vu. What it is dream bridging. The reason that a part of you feels like you've been there before and another part of you feels like you haven't been before, and that's why that's such a paradox, is because every day, and especially in dreaming, your energy body is out scouting energy. And that's where your intuition comes from. You know, this is what people call the higher self, but in the Toltec tradition, we call them the Hual. And so if your energy body goes out and scouts a situation that it wants you to be in and wants you to see, once your physical body shows up to that place, then you have that experience, the deja vu. So there are many things like this, and I can expand on many things, you know, from the Toltec tradition, but a lot of what I'm looking for is interaction and comments. You know, I'll just, you know, like I said, these videos are going to be stream of consciousness until people ask me to focus on any particular subject. I'm gonna definitely consult with health as well. You know, there's so many things about health that are just really basic, depending on how deep you want to get into things. You know, do you really want to start getting into reading white papers and scientific papers? And, you know, longevity is a big thing right now. And, you know, people starting to talk about med beds and, you know, all these things. So, but yeah, I mean, I'm just a salt of the earth, you know, farmer, gardener, and I love plants. So another thing, you know, we can talk about plant medicine. You know, I've experienced, you know, most of the big ones, you know, so we can, you know, talk about that. When my house is a little bit more together, I may be offering in-person hape sessions, which is sacred tobacco, which is administered through the nose. But yeah, I love plants, and also as far as our medicines, you know, tobacco, you know, all these things, learning how to grow and learning, you know, to have the healthiest plants only enhances the power of any medicine you're working with, whether that's broccoli or tobacco. And, you know, nicotine is really big in the news in a lot of places because it is an essential nutrient. They're using it in Alzheimer's. Obviously, you don't want to be addicted to things, and, you know, be careful of your smoking. You know, smoking can be okay, but you have to have the constitution for it. You know, cannabis, like all these things. And the main thing is, how does it make you feel? You know, are you getting healing benefits from it? There's more nicotine in some French fries and ketchup than there is in tobacco, but there are many other elements. And as far as the tobacco that I use is from the Amazon, it's mixed with many other plants. You've got people praying over your tobacco. I want to promote the company Four Visions. They do a number of plant medicines, and they're fantastic people. They give back to all the indigenous that they work with, and there's just a million and one beautiful things on their website. You know, plants you probably never heard of. Another company that I want to promote is Dream Labs. They do a microdose of iboga. So if you are working with any kind of addiction, and this is the thing with iboga, it's not necessarily a substance. Like iboga is here to like break loops, you know, like a negative loop that you're in, and bring you into a better circle. So they do use it, you know, in higher concentrations and more extreme forms, as far as, you know, heroin addiction, alcohol addiction, tobacco, whatever. If you need to go deeper into the root of the problem. And someone that I would recommend as far as the root of the problem, Gabor Mate is an excellent resource once we start getting this more together and I've got videographers and whatnot, we'll be posting links and, things like that. So it's easy to follow, but I'm just trying to get this started, moving, less from my like normal, like 9 to 5 and, working like more at home. So, I'm just going to be doing, promotion like this whenever I feel inspired. And everything that I'm saying right now, and this is what I do in my sessions as well, my family calls me like the master of media because I also follow, movies and TV shows and things like that, because there's messages in everything. So sometimes what happens, if a person is in a healing state or an awakening state, maybe they can't work, they're at home all day, and just helping people like get context. The planet is being liberated. If your planet was being liberated, would you really know? There's just so many things that we do habitually, and then one day just it doesn't feel right. So we need to make a change, whether it's a job, a relationship. I'm a father, so I try to help people with communication with their children. I don't hit my kids. I was hit. There's a very good chance, especially if you're, well, it's still happening and it's sad to see, but most of us didn't really have a childhood. My child has had a childhood. My child has been able to be who she is from day one. Like, the worst thing she's probably seen is, like me and her mother arguing. But even if she ever saw that, we need to come back to her and explain and apologize and, do our best, because a huge part of relationships is if things do go awry is to repair it. But, absolutely, no hitting, or violence ever. And so that's what you're trying to, or that's what a lot of us are trying to do in this generation, or as far as, if we didn't really have a childhood. And when I say we didn't have a childhood, I mean, were you allowed to be who you were from day one? Were you yelled at? Like, were you hit? Were you shamed? Like, that's not a childhood. So it's just an accurate assessment. You didn't have a childhood. Yes, we were children. And, we probably had, like, if you grew up the way that I did, a lot of positive elements. And too, that, especially that generation, nobody's perfect, we're all going to make mistakes. But part of the work that I recommend in complex post-traumatic distress, I got kittens in the house right now. They're scratching under the door. So if anybody's in the Sedona area, we have 2 4-month male cats who are ready for good homes. Complex PTSD. I'm blanking on the author right now, which is why I'm taking notes. But it's just a great resource. When I was doing some of the more like deeper childhood work, that was my Bible at the time. I was just reading that book, constantly, for months. It's just a fantastic healing resource. And, when I, work with people, we'll talk about things like that. I also don't get in over my head. So if you tell me what you're dealing with and it's something that would get me into legal trouble, I may refer you. I have a friend, who's a psychologist who, works with people who've been through some really intense stuff. And if it's outside of my wheelhouse, I'm going to tell you one of the worst things that happens. And, if you go to my Unity Embodiment channel and see some of my posts on Lisa Renee and energetic synthesis, it's just a perfect example when people get in over their head and just can't say, I don't know. Try to counsel people, who are suicidal. It doesn't mean, if you've got some of these things like going on, that I can't, talk to you about it, but I'm just aware, if it's, like I said, if it's going to get me into some legal trouble, if it's, over my head, then I'm going to try to refer you to the best possible practitioner. I had a drug-induced psychotic break in my early 20s. So I've seen some rough stuff, I know what it's like, to feel suicidal. And so, a lot of times, I help people with things like that and some really intense, circumstances, like parents or, family members who've got a young kid, who's waking up and having a really hard time, dark thoughts, all these things. So I do help with those things, but it's a fine line. I just got to make sure, that I don't get into any legal trouble, which is also really interesting because psyche doesn't mean mind. Psyche is the soul. So this is where the planet is at right now. You have to have a license to study a soul. You have to have a license. It's insane. And on the one hand, I mean, yeah, that's understandable. I love therapy. I've had, a number of psychologists, and, it's understandable, just like a, licensed plumber or whatever. But at the same time, if you know how to fix pipes, you know how to fix pipes. So that's something to be just navigated on a personal basis. So yeah, that's where I'm at, with things right now. Like I said, anytime I feel inspired, I'm just going to come in and talk a little bit more, and we can go more in depth if people, comment or, look into my music or, speaking. Oh, and that's the other thing, if you want me to come on your channel, talk more, about a particular subject, there's a couple channels that I want to promote. But again, please apply the 90-10 rule. Some of these people are young and they do great resource, but they're not always the best communicators. And, sometimes even posting videos like so-and-so exposed, so-and-so exposed. Just, I mean, just don't do that. Just don't. I mean, unless it's someone, doing something incredibly malicious, but if there's like a Bible believer, just like saying, and that's the term, that Bible believer. Like, it doesn't make sense to call people Christian. The etymology of Christ goes back to Krishna. It doesn't make any sense. So I just say Bible believers. In all honesty, the false father cults, all the three major religions, Islam, Judaism, what people call Christianity, like, it's all false father cults. If you're taking those texts literally. Now, if you're just reading them to get, insight and reading them as a story, there are history in some of them, but it is so muddy. And there's just so much research being done. I mean, like biblical scholars and religious scholars, it's come so far. So if you're trapped in one of those religions, you could just read a couple books and be done with it, as far as taking it literally, as far as it, the hatred and the violence, that it breeds, and find out a lot of the origins of where these things actually come from. So I recommend Myth Vision podcast. Again, he's young. He does a lot of really great work and has incredible scholars on there. Not always the best communicator. Then his friend, Gnostic Informant, also young, a lot of really great information, but not always the best, communicator. And I'm just going to keep doing things like that. And I'll talk to any of these guys. Anybody I say, something like that, I'll talk to you, that's what we should be doing, talking. And it's nice if you can, the people that you're just like exposing, hopefully if before you, expose them, invite them on your show. And you find, I mean, a lot of, hopefully you can find common ground. But you see the difference of when you get and you're talking to someone, and they may be knowledgeable about a particular subject, but their interpersonal skills are terrible. They can't handle being questioned or criticized, and that gets into the psychology. So it's one thing to write a paper, with information. For you who are, when you're more scientifically minded, we can talk more about scientific papers. I started reading scientific papers during the lockdowns, and just saw how insane so much of it is, just full of logical fallacies, full of speculation, all these things that people just take to the bank, the viruses, which literally had never been proven to exist. And that is science. And when you go in and you read those papers of the people who said that they found it, it's complete nonsense. And if you want to get a bigger breakdown on things like that, Dr. Sam Bailey, I'm blanking on her husband's name, but she's fantastic. And so you have a doctor going through scientific papers, going through scientific history, and showing you the reality of something. Dr. Tom Cowan is another fantastic resource for that, for the new biology clinic. even showing that as far as DNA is real in some way, but that they've also been able to get DNA out of a ballpoint pen. So, and going into, like an electron microscope, and whatever is seen under an electron microscope is like taken down to like negative 400 degrees or something. Just, all these little intricacies, or like the history of, viruses or rabies or whatever. Just, it's fascinating. It's fascinating because it's the truth. And when you break something down and you see the things that are handed down to us that people never actually proved, the very word virus was coined before we even had microscopes. So you get that thing where scientists have a theory and they're looking to prove their theory rather than try to disprove their theory, which is the scientific method. You're trying to prove your hypothesis wrong. And then if you can't prove your hypothesis wrong, then you have a theory. So, and I know, people think that's just like crazy talk, but it's just true, and it's amazing. And so, yeah, and that kind of gets into more, physical health. We talk about taking care of the physical body, a lot of basic things. And then, so what happens, the next time you get a cold, and then you listen to one of these doctors and find out that there's never been there's never been any virus. And they show you how that is not a reality. Like, how do you relate to what's going on with you? How do you relate to what's going on with your body? It's just like, oh yeah, there's a bug going around. Like, what else is going on? Which could, be deep in a lot of different ways. The whole like, lockdown era, that's happened before, as far as that many people on the planet, experiencing that many symptoms, as far as the population at the time. But it's happened before. Everything that we were experiencing during that time, I experienced it all. The whole like non-smelling thing was just one of the craziest things I've ever experienced, but that wasn't new. And people tried to get you to believe that that was new, and that you needed a shot in the arm, so you could smell again. But that symptom has been around for a long time. So things are just getting less and less clamped down. We'll see what happens as far as posting more on YouTube of some of these things. I know people get dinged and even have their channels taken away and all that, but I'll navigate all this, and I'll put it over on Rumble as well. So I don't think anything else in particular is coming up, but next time I get inspired, I'll do it again. Thanks everybody. Take care.